Hi, I'm Rob Britton, a senior advisor here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Thanks for joining today in this webinar on airline pricing called What Am I Paying For? Now, anytime we talk about airline pricing, we inevitably get into a great deal of detail. So I'm not going to be able to, in 45 minutes or so, be able to give you the whole picture of airline pricing. But by answering a few questions, we'll be able to shed some light on how airline pricing works. So let's take a look at the agenda. As I said, what we want to do is answer three questions. Question number one is, why does it sometimes cost more to fly a shorter distance? And when we answer that question, we're going to help you understand the lack of linearity, the lack of a linear relationship between prices and miles. The second question is, why do fares keep changing? Now, you've all had this experience. You check at breakfast time and you look at the price on the website and you say, well, that seems like a reasonable deal. And you check back at lunchtime and the price has gone up $100. Or in some cases, it's gone down $100. So we'll talk about the dynamic aspect of prices and how airlines manage price and inventory. So that's question number two. Question number three is, why has pricing become a la carte? You remember that when you bought an airplane ticket in the past, some years ago, everything was included, and now it's a la carte like a restaurant. So let's get started answering those three questions. Firstly, why are price and distance not linked? Now, we're all familiar with a linear relationship, with a tight relationship between cost and distance. And the best example of that is when we drive a car. If we own an automobile, we're reminded every time we stop for gas. Now, of course, when we drive a car and we own a car, we usually forget about the fixed expense, the ownership expense, the cost of insurance. And typically when we think about automobiles, it's strictly a linear relationship. The further we drive, the more it's going to cost. So every time we go to the gas pump, we're reminded of that linear relationship between cost and distance. And in the airline business, though, in open aviation markets, that is competitive markets like the domestic US market, the Canadian market, markets within the European Union, there are two factors that prevent the price-distance relationship. One of them is that competitors with lower costs set the price points. Now, when I say competitors with lower costs, abbreviated LCCs, low-cost carriers, these are companies like Southwest or Spirit or JetBlue that have significantly lower operating costs compared to the so-called legacy producers, American, Delta, and United. Second reason is that airlines' fixed expenses are very high, typically 70 to 80% of total expense. So let's talk a little bit more about that relationship between price and distance. As I said, newer carriers like Southwest and JetBlue have lower costs, and they use that cost advantage to offer prices that are typically lower than the older airlines. In fact, by definition, the low-cost carriers, Spirit, Southwest, Frontier, JetBlue, they can sell 100% of their inventory, 100% of their seats, at prices lower than the legacy carriers like United or Delta or American. Now, how did we get to this situation? Well, it's mainly history. And what I mean there is that for the first roughly 50 years of the airline industry in the United States, we didn't have the open competitive marketplace that we have today. We had a situation where the federal government very intrusively regulated airlines. And so from 1926 until 1978, an entity of the federal government called the Civil Aeronautics Board set the prices. And they set the prices in such a way that everyone made money and everyone more or less had the same prices and the same costs. And so those historical factors really explain this difference that we have. And what this means is that older airlines have to match prices on at least some seats. And nowadays, as the cost gap between the new companies and older ones has shrunk, older companies like American or Delta or United are able to match much more aggressively the price points that, for example, Southwest Airlines sets. So what this means is that if they're competing with If an older airline like American is competing with a low-cost carrier like Spirit on an 800-mile route, they can offer a $99 fare. But a 400-mile flight in a market that doesn't have low-cost carrier presence might cost $300 or $400. So again, it's the same phenomenon in the marketplace that exists in other kinds of industries. As in other industries, airlines charge what the market will bear. In competitive markets, they will be much more keen to price. The older airlines much more keen to price competitively. If they don't have low-cost carrier competition, for example, in a market like Washington to Hartford, they may not. Now, interestingly, because of the price elasticity of demand, the demand for air travel is elastic. That means the higher the price, the smaller the demand is. Because of that price elasticity reality, if airlines don't match price, they will be worse off in the long run. So every older airline, when newer companies lower the prices, older airlines simply have to match those prices on at least some of their inventory. So that's the reality of old and new. Now, the other reason that accounts for this lack of linearity between price and distance has to do with fixed and variable expense. And as I mentioned, airlines' fixed expenses for things like airplanes, basic levels of labor, and airport rent, those fixed expenses are unrelated to distance. Those have nothing to do with how far an airplane is going to fly. And so, as you can see on the slide, graphically, fixed expense is by far the majority, 70 to 80%, and it depends, 70%, 80%, it really depends on where fuel is, because fuel is the single largest variable expense. But interestingly, even some fuel is a fixed expense, and that part of fuel that's a fixed expense is what's needed for the weight of the empty plane. So simply for the airplane, whether there's passengers in it or not, for the airplane to be able to take off, you need some fixed expense in the form of fuel. So what this also means is that every flight, whether it's a short one or a long one, needs to take off and climb. And the whole process of getting off the ground and climbing to cruising altitude requires lots and lots of energy. Once an airplane is up at cruise altitude, it requires much less energy than the takeoff and the climb. Now, the truth is that if we look at other industries, there are other businesses where price is, if you will, unhinged from cost. We get criticized, airlines get criticized a lot by the media, by politicians, and by others for airline pricing, but there are lots of other industries that offer products where cost and price are unhinged, where price is independent of the cost of production. And my favorite example are Nike sneakers. And so if the kid says, "Mom, will you buy me these cool Nikes? They're only $225. It's a pretty safe bet that Nike manufactured those shoes in Indonesia or in Vietnam or another low-wage place, and the cost of manufacturing those shoes, including the shipping to the United States, was way, way, way less than $225. So many other companies, particularly those luxury brands or well-established brands, are able to price a product independent of the cost of production. Now, the other reality is that there are certain kinds of companies, certain kinds of businesses where the price is highly changeable depending on place and time. And to illustrate that, I'll use my favorite example and ask you the question, how much does Coca-Cola cost? How much? Well, of course, the answer is it depends on where you are and when. If you're at the multiplex cinema, all of you have had this experience. You pay $14 for your admission to the theater, and then you go to the concession stand, to the snack bar counter, and you get a box of popcorn and you get a container of Coke. And sometimes that very small container of Coke will cost you a lot of money. So on a per ounce basis, that Coca-Cola at the cinema costs way more than if you buy a 48-pack of Coca-Cola at the Costco or at Sam's Club. So airlines are not the only people that have these kinds of relationships. So that's the first one. Second question, why do fares keep changing? And as I mentioned when we started, this whole reality that, we check a price in the morning and we say, well, that seems like a reasonable deal. We come back to that same airline website or to Expedia or Orbitz, and we look at noon and the price has gone up or down $50 or $80 or $100. Well, why is that? Well, the reality is that airlines use very sophisticated information technology, as well as some really good brain power, to maximize the revenue, both the passenger and cargo revenue, they get from each flight. You have to remember, of course, that unlike most manufactured goods, seats are a perishable product. That means when, as an example, United Airlines closes the door on a flight today at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and there's open seats, that product is wasted forever. Or for that matter, when they close the belly of the cargo door on the airplane in the belly and there's open cargo space, that available cargo space and that opportunity is lost forever. It's really akin to, think of it like bananas in the supermarket. When the bananas turn brown, the produce manager takes them in the back, they can't sell them anymore. And it's waste just the same. Now, of course, in the case of the airline business, it's not physical waste. So it doesn't seem as apparent as a manufactured product or an agricultural product, but it's just like bananas in the supermarket. So those seats that go empty are just like those bananas that turn brown and cannot be sold. Now, so the question becomes, how do you sell the bananas? Wait, no, that's not right. How do you sell the seats? Airlines face three main risks with these fixed and perishable inventories, these inventories of seats, thousands of seats every day on flights all over the world. And the three risks are firstly oversales, which means that at departure time, the number of customers exceeds the physical number of seats on the airplane. I'll explain why they do this and how this works in a moment. Secondly, what is called spoilage, the risk of spoilage, which means that at some point before departure, some months before departure, an airline will refuse a booking, and then at departure time, those seats will go empty. So that's the reality of spoilage. And the third type of risk is what's called dilution, when you, just like diluting some liquid. Dilution means selling a seat at some time in the past at a price lower than a subsequent customer would be willing to pay. Now, this process of managing a perishable inventory, of managing an inventory in a business with very high fixed costs, really is, like many other businesses, a function of demand. And the whole process of managing flight inventory, deciding how many cheap seats, if you will, to offer, is sort of a reverse engineering process. The objective is never to say no to the late booking full fare customer, to the customer who calls a day or 2 days before departure and says, I really need to get to LA, do you have a seat for me? And the airline always wants to be able to say to that customer, yes, we do. We saved you a seat. Now, of course, the price of that seat will be very high because, why? Because the airline could have sold that seat a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago at a lower cost, admittedly. But they could have sold that seat and had the certainty that that seat would be occupied and that seat would not be wasted or turn brown like the bananas. Now, as a practical matter, seats go on sale in the airline business about 11 months before departure. And in those 330 days, demand for the flight changes. As time goes on, there's a conference or a big meeting or a sports event or something happens that might drive up demand, or perhaps the meeting is canceled or the conference is postponed, demand drops. All sorts of dynamism going on in the marketplace in the 330 days that a particular set of seats on a particular flight are open for sale. And the way this process works is essentially as follows. Airlines combine the patterns of demand from the past with forecasts of future demand in order to decide what seat to sell at what price. Now, if this all sounds a little bit bewildering, let's look at an example. Let's look at a graphic that will help you see how this does actually work in reality. Now, what you're looking at on the slide is a sample flight with an airplane that holds 160 seats. And you're reading from left to right, but on the right-hand side of the graph, you see day of departure, 0. On the horizontal axis, on the x-axis. And if you go look all the way to the left, you see there 330 days before departure when the seats go on sale. Now, as you can see here on the graph, there are three curves. Now on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, as I mentioned, we have days before departure time. And on the vertical axis, on the y-axis, we have the number of seats sold. And as I said, there's three curves. So I want to first draw your attention to the red curve, to the red line. Look at that red line. That is a line that shows expected demand for this particular flight. Now, how do we know what expected demand is? Well, we don't exactly. That's why it's expected. What that red line represents is the pattern of historic demand from years and years and years and years of operating that flight. Suppose it's a departure at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on American Airlines on a Tuesday in January. And suppose it's the third Tuesday in January from Los Angeles to New York. Now, American has been operating that 2 p.m. flight from Los Angeles to New York for years and years and years and years. And they have collected an enormous amount of data on how that flight books up over time. And so what that red line represents is the expected demand for the flight. Now you can see, if you look at the red curve, that it starts out and at 330 days out, and it starts out selling very slowly. And that's very typical. Not many people know 11 or 10 or even 9 months in advance that they're going to need to go on a flight. But as you move towards departure time, you can see that the bookings pick up. And particularly, look at the slope of the red line in the last 30 days before departure, where demand accelerates very dramatically. Now, in this situation, if you follow the red line all the way to 0 to departure time, you see that at 0, at departure time, the flight goes out full at 160 seats. So again, that red line represents all the accumulation of historical data for that particular flight. And as I said, it's date-specific, day of week specific, month specific. It is exactly that particular flight looked at a year before, 2 years before, 3 years, and all that data collected together to create that red curve of expected demand. The second curve that I'd like you to look at is the blue line. And look at that blue line, and as you can see in the legend at the bottom of the slide, that represents demand that is higher than expected. Now we're messing around a little bit with time here, because actually we're looking at this as if it were sometime in the past. Maybe the flight departed an hour ago. But in any case, the blue line represents a situation where demand was higher than expected through time. Now you can see, if you start out just like with the expected demand curve, the red curve, you can see that the blue line of higher than expected demand starts out very sluggish, very slow. Now look at what happens at 240 days before departure. So here we are 8 months out, and all of a sudden that blue curve tilts up very steeply. For whatever reason, maybe it was the announcement of a big conference at the destination city, demand for that flight increases dramatically. And all of a sudden, demand for that flight is much higher than expected. And at that point, what happens is that automatically the IT systems that manage this process for an airline will say, oh, not literally, but they will say to themselves, as if it were literally, oh good, look what's happened, demand has increased. And at that particular point, the system will automatically cut down or depress the availability of cheap seats. So that situation, 240 days before departure, is exactly that scenario that I've talked about a couple of times. You check at breakfast time and the flight is $246 and you think that's a really good deal, and you check back at lunch and it's gone up 50 or 80 or $100. That's that point where all of a sudden actual demand is higher than expected, and the airline says, we've got to stop selling the cheap seats. Let's start selling more expensive seats. Now again, if you follow that blue curve across, you'll see that it goes along, and at some point it actually falls below expected demand. And for a brief period, about 90 days in advance, you may see a situation where the cheap seats all of a sudden might open up again. And the opposite situation happens there. All of a sudden, for some brief period of time, some cheap seats may be available. So it's a dynamic process. Now, if you follow that blue line all the way to the right-hand side to the time of departure or just before departure, you see a situation where there's a potential oversale. You see just about at zero, and this is not quite accurate because it's about an hour before the actual time of departure, there are 170 bookings for 160 seats. Now, you've all seen the way that airlines manage that process. At the gate, they ask for volunteers, and they ask for people willing to give up their seat on that flight in exchange for a travel voucher. And all of a sudden, by buying off some of the people that have flexible travel plans, they've solved the problem, and the plane goes out full. The third and final curve or line that I'd ask you to look at on this curve is the green one. And that is exactly the opposite of the blue one. That is the curve showing a situation where actual demand for that particular flight was lower than expected. And so you can see there that for most of the way across, from 330 days out until day of departure, demand for the flight was lower than expected. And so the opposite situation happens in this scenario. That typically in a situation like the green line flight, the airline will be selling cheap seats for a long, long time, and people will get a bargain up until whenever. Now, the control on that, as you know, because you all buy airplane tickets, is that oftentimes those very cheap seats have an advance purchase requirement that requires you to buy the ticket, say 21 days before departure, 14 days before your departure, whatever. But in any case, when we get to departure point for the green line flight, where demand was lower than expected, you actually see a situation where the plane goes out with empty seats. In this case, it goes out with 20 seats empty. So it may be a middle of the day flight that simply never fills up. So that gives you a good illustration of what's called dynamic pricing. The reality that airlines use historical patterns of demand or demand from the past as a way to predict what and how to sell their seats on a particular flight going forward from when they begin to sell the seats. So that's the answer, somewhat long-winded, to the second question on why do prices change over time. And the third question is, why has pricing become a la carte? Historically, as I mentioned at the beginning, airline services were sold as an inclusive package with all of the elements combined into a single price. And so I have drawn from the archive here a wonderful photograph of jet travel in 1959 or 60 with people sitting in the first class lounge on a Pan Am flight and the flight attendant serving coffee from a silver pot, and everything looks posh. And when they bought that airplane ticket back then, and even as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, when you bought an airplane ticket, everything was included. The trend nowadays, as you know, from the last 10 or 15 years has been to unbundle the airline ticket. All of those services that were sold, all cobbled together, have been unbundled. And as I mentioned, this process began about a decade ago when older U.S. airlines, all of them at the time, this is back 2003, 2004, 2005, in very serious financial situation, much different than the situation today. These older U.S. airlines understood that unbundling the services would increase revenues, and it would provide a number of benefits. Firstly, and this is very, very important, and this was in fact the motivating and driving force, it would make it easier for the older airlines to match the new airlines' lower prices. Remember earlier when we started this webinar, I talked about the reality that it's the younger, newer airlines that set the price points. And so unbundling the product, taking some of the pieces away from what was formerly sold as a collective service, would make it easier for an airline to match the $79 or $99 fare that Southwest Airlines was selling. The most successful low-cost carrier outside the United States, the low-cost carrier in Europe, Ryanair, used this a la carte model from the very beginning. And in fact, at the time that Ryanair became a scheduled airline, they understood that it made a great deal of sense to sell their product much the same way that a restaurant with an a la carte menu sells its. If you don't want dessert, you don't pay for dessert. In the case of Ryanair, if you want to check a bag, you pay extra to check the bag. If you want an assigned seat, you pay extra for the assigned seat. And so that idea of an a la carte pricing model was originally pioneered by a low-cost carrier, but then very quickly copied by older airlines in many parts of the world, especially here in the United States. Now, initially, airline customers, you go back 2003, 4, and 5, when this whole unbundling process started. Initially, customers resisted the idea. Well, of course they did. Everybody likes a free lunch. Everyone wanted a free meal or a free checked bag. But what has happened as time has gone on is that they've not only come to accept this idea, but they actually like the idea that if they don't need to check a bag, they don't need to pay to check a bag. And so the idea is very similar to the restaurant. If you don't want dessert, you don't pay for it. Now, so what began as necessity, a way for the older airlines to pull some expense out of their product offering in order to price their product more competitively with the newer companies, has really morphed into a business opportunity. And what airlines refer to as ancillary revenues have become vitally important. And as we go forward, will become more so. And all of you that travel, all of you that fly, are familiar with the fact that as time has gone on, not only has the product become unbundled with respect to paying for a checked bag, but for many airlines, for example, if you want to sit in seats that have more legroom, in economy class, you pay for that. You want to sit in the exit row, you pay for that, and so on and so forth. And so this idea of selling a basic ticket at a basic price and then selling up, something that's used extensively in many other industries, has become quite popular in the airline industry, both for older companies like American or Delta or United, or for that matter, British Airways and Lufthansa in Europe, as well as, of course, for the newer companies, for Southwest and JetBlue, WestJet in Canada, Ryanair in Europe. So with that, we come to the end of the webinar. Again, it would be really, really hard to explain all of how airline pricing works, but I think by looking at those three questions, at looking at this lack of relationship between price and distance, by looking at this reality of dynamic pricing, and by looking at this whole question of unbundling the product, you've gotten a better sense of how airlines make these decisions in an industry with very punishing financials, with high fixed costs, with lots of factors that are outside of their control, and so on and so forth. So thanks for joining us for this. If you have questions or comments, you can email us, as you see there on the slide. Email us at publicaffairs@enotrans.org, and I'd be delighted to try to answer your question. Thanks again for joining us. Have a good day.